slides now.
Perfect.
So there's me, as I just introduced myself. Alicia Secor is also on the phone. She's our Chief Commercial Officer. And then Alice Chen at the bottom of the slide is our Clinical Director of Operations. She's the one who takes care of all the details of running a trial. And of course, she plays a very important role, and she can answer many of your questions that you might have about some of the visit schedules and things like that. I'm an endocrinologist by training and have been in diabetes and obesity research most of my career. And Alicia Secor comes to us by way of Genzyme, which many of you may know is an orphan drug company. And she's, of course, an expert in addressing that orphan drug market. Zafton is a small biotech company in Boston, located in Boston, and we've been working on this drug called Beloranib for the last several years. It's not until fairly recently a light bulb went on above our heads and thought that this may be a good match for Prader-Willi syndrome patients. So here we are after having completed an earlier proof of concept phase 2 trial sometime about a year ago. Now we're fully engaged in running this phase 3 trial. For those of you who may not know what that means in terms of phase 2 versus phase 3, phase 3 is the last kind of step in drug development or clinical trial studies where the FDA requires kind of a long-term effectiveness and safety evaluation of the drug in a clinical study. And once that program is done in phase 3, then we submit the results to the FDA, and they will review the results and see if the drug is safe enough and effective enough to be commercialized. So with that introduction, Alicia, do you have anything else to say before I start into the study design? Or Alice?
Yeah, no, I don't. At this point, I just want to say that on behalf of FPWR and the entire community, we really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys today. And hopefully it'll be an informative discussion. And I think, Dennis, we should probably just get right into it in the spirit of time.
Great. Okay, will do. If we can move the slide forward, please. As I mentioned before, we're engaged in the phase 3 study in patients with Prader-Willi syndrome. It is a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. And what that means is that during the conduct of the trial, at least the main part of the trial, nobody will know, not us, not the study site physicians or caregivers, or the patients, nobody will know who's actively receiving drug versus placebo. And that this is the gold standard clinical trial design for an intervention like a drug that's being investigated. We are looking to enroll 102 patients across 15 different study sites in the United States. We've chosen these 15 study sites strategically to be distributed fairly evenly across different geographic locations in the United States. So most of the major areas of the United States are represented. So hopefully that if there are patients who would like to participate, they don't have to go too far to find a study site that they can work with. Eligible patients are to be assigned to one of the 3 arms of the trial. And you see that at the table below here. So patients will be randomized. It's like flipping a coin. And this is purely by chance. And they will be randomized to receive the higher dose of the drug, which is 2.4 milligrams of Beloranib, the lower dose of the drug, which is 1.8 milligrams of Beloranib, or placebo. And you can see that the number of patients to be distributed across these 3 arms are evenly matched. 34 patients per arm, which brings us to 102 patients across 3 arms. Next slide, please. The main reasons for running this trial from our perspective, and of course, after having talked with the FDA, are to look at these specific changes which we deem as being of critical importance for patients and their families who live with Prader-Willi syndrome. And we've come up with these objectives after having done a lot of work and due diligence on what is the greatest unmet need in these patient populations, and of course what the FDA cares about the most. Having said that, the primary objective, that is to say the most important objectives for the study, is to see how the body weight changes over time and how hyperphagia-related behaviors change over time from baseline to after 6 months of the trial. And we will compare that change that we see in patients who took beloranib for 6 months and compare that to the change we see in patients who took placebo for 6 months. And that is how we see if the drug is effective and safe when we make that comparison. Hyperphagia-related behavior, some of you may know this term and some of you may not. Hyperphagia-related behavior is a group of behaviors that's related to food, and I would say I would qualify it as saying it's problematic behaviors from the perspective of most people that patients with Prader-Willi syndrome may engage in that's specific to food issues. And we can go into this a little bit further, a little bit later in the presentation. But it's a series of questions that we ask the caregivers to answer based on the observations that they made over the past 2 weeks before the question is administered. And again, the details we can cover a little bit later. The secondary objectives, that is to say, these are still important, but they are secondary to the study, are still important health-related objectives that we'd like to take a look at. And these include body mass and body composition, specifically the amount of total body fat somebody carries versus the amount of total lean mass somebody carries, and how that changes over time after having taken the drug for 6 months. And this is assessed by what's called a dual X-ray absorptiometry, or also called DEXA scan. Some of you may be familiar with DEXA scans because many patients with Prader-Willi syndrome have this assessment done. And it's a technology that allows us to look at just how much of your total body mass is made up of fat versus non-fat tissue. It is also a technology that's used to measure bone mineral density, or to follow patients with osteoporosis. So it also tells you just how dense your bone is or how much calcium you're carrying in your bones. This is a well-recognized and safe technology to assess these type of changes, and so that's the top secondary objective. We'll also be looking at certain classic obesity-related metabolic markers. These are also often called cardiovascular risk factors, such as changes in lipid parameters, which include total cholesterol, triglyceride, LDL, which is often referred to as bad cholesterol, and HDL, which is often called a good cholesterol. So we've seen indications in our prior trials that these cholesterol parameters change in favorable direction after patients take the drug for a certain amount of time. And we'd like to confirm that this is still the case after 6 months in patients with Prader-Willi syndrome. There are other secondary endpoints or objectives that's included in the study, but in the interest of time and keeping things simple, we won't go into that at this point. Next slide, please. Susan, have you, here it is, okay. So the study design, we'll go further into the study design. Eligible patients who enroll into this study will receive approximately 6 months of randomized treatment. And randomized treatment just means that either beloranib, which is the active study drug, or placebo for 6 months. The drug or the placebo is injected as twice weekly subcutaneous injection, which just means it's done under the skin. For those of you who may have used insulin or growth hormone or even tuberculosis testing, this is similar to that. You introduce the needle just below the skin and the drug is introduced. The appearance of the drug versus placebo is identical. These things are administered without, again, study site or patient knowledge of what they're getting for 6 months. Now, when patients complete the 6 months of randomized blinded treatment, they will be offered an extension for additional 6 months where things won't be blinded at this point. And all patients at this point can receive and will receive, if they agree, to receive beloranib for 6 additional months. So that means patients who are receiving beloranib all along in the first 6 months will have a chance to receive beloranib for full 12 months if they opt in to enroll into the open label extension. And patients who got placebo for the first 6 months will have an opportunity to receive beloranib for the next 6 months, and while fully knowing that they're getting drug. So it is at this point no longer blinded and no longer randomized. And this we view as being important because we'd like to get as much information as possible about the effectiveness and safety as well as tolerability of the drug over a 12-month period, not just 6 months. And we think that it's important to offer an incentive for patients who may have been enrolled into the placebo arm of the trial to receive active drug once they've completed the first 6 months of the trial. We see here the eligibility criteria, and these are high-level, I would say, highlights of all the different eligibility criteria that we have set forth for the trial. There are others other eligibility criteria that's not included here, but these are the most important ones. So males and females, aged between 12 to 65, genetically confirmed diagnosis of Prader-Willi syndrome. Especially older patients may have had their Prader-Willi syndrome diagnosed clinically without genetic testing. So we would like to confirm everybody to have had Prader-Willi syndrome. And we will pay for the genetic testing to be done if one wasn't already performed previously. We're looking for patients who have a high BMI, body mass index. This is an indicator of how heavy somebody is and an indicator of how much fat mass they carry. It's in a scientific medical world, we call this obesity or being overweight. And it is defined by body mass index of equal to greater than 30. And we are capping the top end at 60. The body mass index is calculated by the amount of weight in kilograms divided by your height that is squared in meters. And so the unit is kilogram per meter squared. And I realize that most of us talk about things in pounds and inches or feet, but there are easy ways to calculate your BMI on most of the health-focused websites that you can access. If you just enter your height and weight into a BMI calculator, it'll, even in pounds and meters, it'll spit out a BMI number. This is for adult patients. For adolescent patients between the ages of 12 and 17, a body mass index of 30 or less than 60 doesn't work out so well because these patients are shorter and they're growing actively. So for adolescent patients, what we define as obesity is BMI of greater than or equal to 95th percentile for age and gender. And I won't go into what that means here because I think it's beyond the scope of this discussion, but your study site physicians or healthcare provider can easily calculate this for you if you get in touch with them. The patient has to have at least one consistent primary caregiver who is able to evaluate behavioral changes. Because, as I said before, change or improvement in hyperphagia behavior is an important objective for the study. And patients with Prader-Willi syndrome have not been reliably documented to self-report these changes in behavior. We are going to rely on the caregiver to report any observed changes in their patient's behavior, especially food-related behaviors. So we would like this caregiver to be knowledgeable, consistent, and be able to accurately and precisely report behavioral changes, which we will ask about several times during the study participation. And for this reason, we are asking patients mostly to, for eligibility criteria, patients to be living in a family home most of the time. Because for patients who live in their family homes, the primary caregiver is usually going to be the mom or the dad. And that is, as we see it, probably the most reliable caregiver and a caregiver that's unlikely to change over the course of the study. Whereas patients who live in a group home, more than 50% of times, we may have to rely on a caregiver that's a paid staff at the group home. And we believe, or our view is that may not result in the most accurate and precise reporting of any behavioral changes that the patient may undertake, because a professional paid group home staff is probably not going to be with the patient as much, probably not going to be as knowledgeable about the patient's behavioral patterns as much, and there's certainly, of course, a reasonable risk that the staff may quit or move on to a different job or get a promotion, in which case, we would lose any knowledge that staff member may have had about the patient. And so this is the main reason why we're asking patients who live in family homes to participate in this study. Next slide shows some of the study participation details. We are requiring certain study visits to the clinical sites. Most of the patient and the caregiver's participation in the study will be done from home. But about once a month on average, we're going to ask you and your patient in your care to come into the clinical study site for a face-to-face visit. This is because we need to collect certain safety information and collect blood draws, weigh patients, do DEXA scans, and other safety parameters that's required as part of this type of study. Again, the study drug is to be administered twice weekly, whether or not you're taking active study drug, beloranib, or placebo. Now, because we'd like to unburden you as much as possible, we are going to send a home health nurse to your house or to your location of your preference twice weekly for the most of the study drug administration for the first 6 months of the trial. And for patients who, for any patients actually, and their caregiver who will be asking to come into the study site once per month on average, we will reimburse you for your travel cost. If you don't live very far away, the travel cost will be fairly nominal. But if you do live far away and you either have to fly in or drive long distances and maybe even obtain a place to sleep or stay overnight, that will be, of course, reimbursed as appropriate. You can also go to a clinical study site. This is a government-run internet website where they list all the ongoing clinical studies in this website called www.clinicaltrials.gov. And if you search, or if you enter search term Zastrin PWS, you will come across some more details about the eligibility criteria and study participation and study schedule that I may not cover here for time reasons. Next slide, please. So I only have a few more slides left, and I think it's worth going into what we mean when we say we'd like to evaluate how the drug may improve or not improve hyperphagic behavior. And that is tracked or measured by having you answer hyperphagia questionnaire several times during the study. And this instrument is called Hyperphagia Questionnaire. It was developed at University of Vanderbilt by Dr. Elizabeth Dykens, who is an expert and has done a lot of research in patients with Prader-Willi and how they behave in relation to food. We've modified that questionnaire just a little bit for the purposes of this trial, and we're using this instrument as one of the primary objectives of how the drug may or may not help you or your patient or your patient in care with PWS. And as you can see, the instruction for filling out these questions as a caregiver is to think carefully and in some details about the last 2 weeks of how the patient in your care have behaved in relations to food. And we ask you to fill this out as accurately and as honestly as you can without minimizing or overinflating the person's behavior. And because we want to be able to demonstrate an improvement in this set of behaviors, we are looking for patients who demonstrate a certain level of problematic hyperphagic behavior at baseline. Because if there's no hyperphagic behavioral problems at baseline, then there's really nothing to improve with respect to those behaviors. And that would not serve the purpose of the study. And that's why we would like to see patients who are initially, first of all, heavy or obese, and who also demonstrate, as measured by this questionnaire, some level of hyperphagic behavioral problems. And if we go to the next slide, some of the behaviors we're talking about will be outlined in these set of questions. So this instrument called Hyperphagia Questionnaire consists of 9 questions, and it's really based on the last 2 weeks of behaviors that's been observed by the caregiver. And as you can see here, during the last 2 weeks, how upset did the person in your care generally become when denied a desired food? And for all these questions, there will be 5 actually levels of answers, which will score from 0 to 4. So if somebody becomes very, very upset, then somebody might score high on this particular question. And question number 2 gets at how often did the person try to bargain or manipulate to get more food at meals? How often did the person forage through trash for food, as question number 3 asks? How often did the person get up at night to seek food? And question 5, how persistent was the person in asking or looking for more food after being told no? Next slide. Outside normal meal times, how much time did the person generally spend asking or talking about food? How often did the person try to sneak or steal food? And when others tried to stop the person from asking about food, how distressed did he or she generally appear? How often did food-related behavior interfere with a person's normal daily activities? So these are questions only someone who is intimately knowledgeable about the patient's behavior can answer accurately. And that's why, as a caregiver, most often parents, you're a critical part of this trial. And we rely on you to be able to report back to us if there has been any changes that you've observed with respect to these 9 questions about the patient in your care. Next slide. So I think that brings us to a close in terms of some of the details about the study conduct and design. At this point, I will turn it over back to Susan to moderate any other discussions we might have or Q&A that we might engage in.
Thank you, Dennis, for providing such a wonderfully informative information on your study. We do have a couple of questions which we could perhaps answer now or at the end of the presentation. What is your preference?
Well, if Elizabeth, Ruth, or Alice and Olivia have any comments that they'd like to make, maybe this might be a good time to do that.
All right, there is one question regarding the hyperphagia questionnaire, which is what if the subject never foraged for food, for example, in the trash?
Yeah, if that's the case, then that patient would probably score 0 on that particular question. But there are obviously 8 other questions where they can score, anywhere from 0 to 4, and we'll add up all those scores to see if somebody qualifies for the study, because they have to have some minimum criteria to get into the study in terms of demonstrating some of those behaviors.
Okay, great. So again, we do have more questions, but we will hold them until the end of the presentation. Next, we have Alice Viraslav. Alice is a founding member of the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research. She's also an active board of directors for the foundation. Alice has been participating with her daughter Olivia in the bestPWS trial at the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center location. Alice, are you there?
I am, Susan. Hi, everybody. So first, I want to thank everybody for being on the webinar today, and particularly the folks from Zafton and Vanderbilt. We all really appreciate you joining us. And Susan asked me to talk a little bit about her personal experience with the Zafton trial. Olivia, I think, is actually probably one of the first participants in the trial. She started at Vanderbilt in October. And we actually live in San Antonio, but we have some ties to Vanderbilt. My oldest daughter is a senior there. She volunteers with the Prader-Willi Initiatives Program at the Kennedy Center. So even though Vanderbilt is a short flight for us, we felt that was a good place for us to participate in the trial. Prior to the trial, we had a pre-screening on the phone. We talked to the Vanderbilt folks to make sure that there wasn't anything major that would come up that would disqualify Olivia from participation, that she met the basic criteria, et cetera. And then we went out for our first visit in October. The first visit, we did additional pre-screening, again, to make sure that it was safe for Olivia to participate and that she met all the criteria. She underwent a series of tests, including blood draws, the DEXA scan that the dentist referred to, and some psychological screening and questioning with Elizabeth Ruth. And then she received her first dose of the medication actually on site at Vanderbilt, which I can tell you made me feel better because, it's a new drug, and I was happy that she would receive her first dose there. That visit took a few hours, no more than 3 hours, I think possibly less than that. But one of the wonderful things about the visit is that we actually had the opportunity to meet other Prader-Willi families, some of whom we were familiar with from Facebook and other organizations, some of whom we had never met. And we got to interact and visit with them, and that was really a wonderful benefit of the study. When we left, we got drug that we took home that we keep in the refrigerator, and we have a home health care nurse who comes twice to our house, once on Mondays, once on Thursdays. In our case, she comes before school because that's the easiest time of the day to administer the drug, and it's an injection. And since all of our kids, or at least a large majority of our kids, are on growth hormone, one more injection is not that big of a deal. And it's no bigger of a deal than the growth hormone injection that almost all of our kids get every day. And I can tell you that we've traveled a couple of times. The study organizers have arranged for home health care nurses when we've traveled. It's been a very, very painless experience. They've all been very nice. It's been very organized, and so it hasn't limited us in any way of doing whatever we want to do. We haven't had to limit our schedule or limit our travel because Olivia is on the trial. in terms of the trial itself, you know, Olivia's 18, she's actually 19 now, she just turned 19, and we clearly talked with her about consenting for this trial because she's old enough to decide whether she wants to participate or not. And she was happy to do it and excited to do it. But, you know, anytime you start a new drug trial, I think anybody is a little nervous because you really, you know, you're kind of, it's a little bit of uncharted territory. In this particular case, we knew that this drug had already been tested in people with Prader-Willi here and in Europe, and that the side effect profile was very safe. So we felt like this was a quote-unquote safe risk for Olivia, which indeed has been. So I actually will stop there unless you have anything else you'd specifically like me to talk about, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end of the call about what it's like to participate in the trial, anything I haven't covered, or any other questions that you have for me.
Thank you, Alice. I really appreciate you sharing your personal story regarding your participation in the study. Next we have,
if I might chime in just to make one point of clarification. This is Dennis Kim again. And thanks for that as well, Ms. Viroslav. I didn't want to butcher your name, so I called you Alice before, but we really appreciate your input here. Just to kind of clarify the point she made, Beloranib, which is the drug that's been tested in this trial, has been evaluated in a small, short study in patients with Prader-Willi syndrome at University of Florida as a part of the phase 2 program. We have not yet tested the drug in Europe, but we plan to come middle of this year. We will be opening up another phase 3 study there. But it has been tested in Australia and in the United States in other types of patients who suffer from similar diseases or obesity. The drug has been tested in similar doses of 1.8 and 2.4 in up to about 200 patients with what I'll call conventional obesity, or what's also called hypothalamic injury-associated obesity, which is a little bit of a sister syndrome to Prader-Willi syndrome. So we have a reasonable amount of clinical trial experience with the drug, and as has been mentioned, we've been encouraged by what we think is a pretty good risk-benefit profile of the drug being effective and yet being fairly safe and well-tolerated. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Dennis, for providing that information.
I'll add one other thing. Thanks for that clarification. I do want to add one other thing. As Dr. Kim mentioned, this is a double-blind controlled study, meaning that you don't know what your child is receiving, and they may not be receiving drug at all. And we went into that basically with eyes wide open. We fully understand that Olivia may or may not be receiving drug. The way that we looked at it was that if she receives drug, that's great. If she doesn't, it's 6 more months of the same thing we've been living with for 19 years. And it's no different. So we were very, very willing to do that, understanding that she might or might not get drug, because we felt that it was so important to participate in finding out whether this drug is effective for our kids. So I do want to specifically make that point as well so people understand that as well.
Thank you, Alice. Next, we want to bring on Elizabeth Roof from the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center to talk a little bit about what the study participation is like at the location.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. So, and it was great to hear from Dennis and Alice, and I actually have more pictures of Olivia and other people. So we'll talk a little bit about what it's like, and I tell people, you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and we have lots of pictures of families kind of participating, and so we have 18 people enrolled here. We started actually back in September, so we started first and have seen actually a fair number of people. I really feel like we know what we're doing at this point, and so basically you come in, you bring your family, you ask a bunch of questions about what it's like to be in the study. We give a lot of information over the phone, so you have a pretty good idea of what you're getting into here. And then when you get there, once we sign the consent forms, then we actually start the study procedures. And so, again, we try to make it as seamless and as kind of fast and efficient as we can. So we want families to be able to do that. We talk about what it's like to be in the study for the person who has Prader-Willi syndrome. Again, they have some cognitive delays and deficits. We want everyone to understand what they're agreeing to, and even though their parents sign a informed consent document, which is kind of a legal document, they sign an assent form, and we go over kind of everything they're going to be doing, what it looks like, what a placebo is, all that kind of stuff so that they understand, and then they can ask any questions. We try to use language that they can understand. You get a gown on, you get weighed, a doctor's going to do a physical, we get a blood sample, which is never fun for people with PWS, but we try to make it as easy as we can, and we have really experienced staff, so they're really good at getting blood for people with PWS. You can switch to the next one. So we get a blood pressure. There's Olivia again. She's just everywhere. To an EKG. It's just not painful at all. Little stickers on your chest. And we just make sure you're really healthy before we actually give you your first dose. We ask if you've been sick, what medicines you're taking, all sorts of other things. And every time you come in, we get some of that basic information. We also ask about things like, has your child had any change as far as appetite or things like that? And that's the Hyperphagia questionnaire. That's what the DEXA looks like. You're laying on a nice kind of cushy table. You lay flat for a few minutes. You get an x-ray of muscle mass, fat mass, bones, all that kind of stuff. It is really not hard at all to do, and most of the patients, if they want to, they fall asleep, and it's all good. We serve breakfast. Some patients choose to go out for breakfast. There's a list of restaurants that are pretty close by after we get blood and urine samples, so that's always something everybody looks forward to after doing, blood samples, so we do that. You can switch to that one. We are a site that's probably unlike a lot of others because we can actually see multiple patients at a time. We have a research center, and we've done a couple of clinical trials where we see multiple patients at a time, so they get to meet other families. They really like exchanging stories, and they get to do puzzles, kind of meet other people, and we usually have some downtime where they can do that. And I think that's one of the things that's unique to our site that people really enjoy is meeting other people who are about their same age. We play games. We've got everything from Sorry to Candyland. We play all sorts of things with them. We want it to be a fun experience for them. And some of the people after they leave end up staying in touch by Facebook and other means, and so it's really nice. That's what the injection looks like. No biggie. Doesn't hurt. People really tolerate it well. We haven't had any complaints about it, and it just really takes a few seconds to do it, just like growth hormone. You take home your medicine kits till we see you next time. A visit can take about an hour up to 4 hours, depending on how long we have to, how everything flows, but usually it's pretty good. And then you leave and you go home, and we see you again in a month. And so people go, sometimes they fly home, sometimes they drive home, and we try to make it as pleasant as we possibly can. And so once they go home with their parents, they leave with their medicine, they see their home health nurse as needed, and then they come back in a month or so. So after you have that first initial phone conversation, you may have lots of questions. So feel free to ask the site wherever you decide to go what it's like, how they do things, what it's going to be like, because I think kids with Prader-Willi really want to know how it's going to be, what it's going to be like, and I can tell you that our patients are more comfortable every single visit than the one before, and so now it really feels seamless. We have enrolled a lot of people, and we are actually getting ready to enroll our first person in the long-term extension in the end of March. So any questions anyone else has?
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that quick run-through on what you can expect. There are a number of questions that have been presented, so I am happy to start going through some of these. The first question was about residency. Can Canadians participate in any of the U.S. locations?
Alice, I will ask you to address that question since you probably know that situation the best.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Unfortunately, at this time, we are not prepared to accept patients from Canada because we do not currently have regulatory approval in Canada. However, we are looking into that possibility, and so I would encourage even families that are in Canada to perhaps get in touch with their nearest sites in the U.S. so they could provide the contact information to the site, and if that regulatory status changes, then the coordinator will have your information on hand to contact you.
Thank you.
Alice, can you talk about when you might expect those regulatory changes to occur? Just in a ballpark figure.
Yeah, it's sort of difficult to say because we're waiting for feedback, but we hope it will be, very soon. I would imagine probably in the next, month or so.
Great, thank you.
Wonderful. Can you share with us the potential side effects that someone might experience?
Sure. So in our prior clinical trials, in patients with or without Prader-Willi syndrome, the most common, well, let me talk first to patients who don't have Prader-Willi syndrome. When we test the drug in those type of patients, the most common side effects we see are sleep disturbances and some GI side effects. We also see injection site reactions, such as a little bruising or redness and pain, but that's not different from patients who took drug versus placebo. So we don't think that's a very concerning adverse event. These are generally very mild and self-limiting. When it comes to sleep disturbances, we see most commonly, almost always, patients complain about not being able to fall asleep as fast. That is in patients without Prader-Willi syndrome. We also see some level of nausea and, to a much lesser extent, vomiting in patients who took drug. Again, mild, transient, self-limiting. Now, when we decided to enter into Prader-Willi field and test the drug in those patients, our hypothesis was that patients with Prader-Willi, since they seem to have hypersomnolence, that is a tendency to sleep a lot and fall asleep very fast, and also, of course, there's less tendencies to have GI symptoms in patients with Prader-Willi syndrome. We thought that this drug side effect profile might match the patients very well, and so far that's what we've seen. In our earlier trial, we saw really very little signals of sleep disturbance in patients with Prader-Willi syndrome, and almost no GI side effects. So far, it seems to be very well tolerated in patients with Prader-Willi syndrome, but I say that with a caveat that we don't have a huge amount of sample size experience in terms of number of patients that have taken the drug so far.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dennis. There's a question regarding recruitment sites. Is there a limit to how many patients can be accepted per clinical location?
Not officially. For example, Vanderbilt has now 18 study. I think you said 18. Mm-hmm. Is that right, Elizabeth?
Yep, yeah, that's right.
And I think there's no set limit on how many patients can be enrolled at one study site. Although there may be some capacity constraints at each study site, I imagine if Vanderbilt got 30 or plus patients, they might start to experience some capacity constraints, and they may ask to stop enrolling more additional patients. So far, we've not come across those type of problems at all, and I don't anticipate that that'll happen at any of the study sites.
If a patient is told that a study site is closed, can they select another study location?
Yes, they can. Again, I don't anticipate closing any of the study sites unless if the study site tells us they just can't take any more because of too much work and they don't have the staff. Mm-hmm. So that hasn't happened, and I don't anticipate happening. But if that were to happen on an outside chance, yes, they can go to another study site. They can travel, fly, train, automobiles, and get to another study site, and we would reimburse you for that.
Okay. Can a study site be selective over which patients they allow into their study? For example, can they accept a patient, or can they limit patients to patients that are currently being seen for other purposes at that site?
There's no, as far as how the study protocol is written, there's no limitations to such an effect. Again, each study site might have their preferences, and they may ask us or decide to accept certain patients at that study site. But again, I don't see that happening very often, if at all, because we are looking for as many patients we can get as fast as we can get. And so far, that hasn't been a problem that we faced.
Mm-hmm. Our PWS community dietitian is on the call today, Melanie Silverman. She had a question regarding diet. Will there be any detailed evaluation by a dietitian on the specific foods patients eat or drink during their time on the study drug or placebo?
No, there's no such instructions. So what we want to see is patients deciding to change their diet or behavior. They may even not decide it. This might all be kind of a subconscious thing as a result of taking drug or being as part of being participating in the trial. We want to isolate the effects of the drug and how it differs from placebo. And for that reason, we've decided not to introduce any other variables, such as providing certain instructions in terms of diet and exercise habits.
Is the use or abstention of utilizing growth hormone going to prevent someone from participating?
No, and that's true also of many other medications that patients with Prader-Willi syndrome take, such as other hormone replacement therapy they may be on, like thyroid or sex hormones, or glucocorticoid, like steroids or vasopressin. We know that patients with Prader-Willi syndrome take a lot of concomitant medications, and as long as the dosage of each of these medications have been stable for a certain amount of months, and there are different requirements of stability that we'd like to see before patients come into the study. As long as those conditions are met, we're okay with patients taking all these usual medications that patients with Prader-Willi syndrome usually take.
And I'd like to add that we haven't had any problems with people being, we've only had one person who wasn't a good fit because their medications had changed. Between the psych meds they'll allow, it's a very, that part to me is really nice to get kind of a naturalistic approach to what people normally take. And so we're not limiting people really in any way. So it really is just the idea that you're not starting a new drug in the last 3 months or 6 months, depending on what it is, or things are changing dramatically. So that probably has not been a problem at all.
Mm-hmm. Once the FDA receives phase 3 results, what is the typical time frame until they either approve or do not approve?
It's difficult to say what's typical because it can range dramatically depending on each circumstance. For an orphan indication like Prader-Willi syndrome, the FDA usually takes a little bit shorter because they recognize that there's great unmet need in that disease space. In a normal situation, quote unquote normal being non-orphan orphan drug space, that the average time can range from 10 months to several years. But in an orphan disease situation, depending on the results of the study, if the results of the study are clearly supportive of a drug being effective and safe, then it can be as short as 6 months, but as long as, many, many more months longer than that, or even several years. So it all depends on the situation.
Mm-hmm. If this drug is approved by the FDA, when will individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome be allowed to take the drug? Meaning, what indication will they have to show in order to begin taking the drug?
So I'll start the answer to that question, and then maybe I can ask Alicia to chime in. If the drug is approved by the FDA, it will most likely be approved for indication of treatment for patients with Prader-Willi syndrome who have obesity and hyperphagic behaviors, because that's exactly the type of patients we're studying. And it is anticipated that within weeks or a few months of the FDA approval, that we would have the drug commercially available for usage by, by prescription. But I say that as a guess, and this is where I would ask Alicia to chime in.
Sure, thanks, Dennis. So I think once the FDA and Zafgen reach the conclusion that the data is compelling enough to warrant approval, the company would negotiate with the FDA around the specific language in the label, which Dennis alluded to what we hope the label would say. And then once all of that is finalized, it's just a matter of, some logistics on Zafgen's part to make sure that we can get the product packaged and labeled appropriately, supplied into our specialty pharmacy or distribution channel. And usually what happens is after the drug approved the product, it can be available for patients anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks after that date. So that's the best informed guess at this point. But certainly we would do everything and anything possible to expedite that.
Do you foresee this drug becoming available to non-obese PWS patients?
It's a great question. I think that's part of the label negotiation that you go through with the FDA once the studies are over and once the drug is determined to be safe and effective. And that's true also of other things like patients who may not have or demonstrate hyperphagic behavior. Could the drug still be used in those patients? And that's part of the discussions we'll have with the FDA on how broad the treatment indication will be, and that's a lot of it is dependent on what the study shows. The other important factor that I didn't mention, which I overlooked, is the age limitations that we're likely to have when we, if and when we have the drug available, commercially approved by the FDA. And because the drug has not been tested in children under the age of 12, the label in all most likelihood will be limited to patients with Prader-Willi syndrome who are older or equal to 12 years of age initially. We have plans to do further studies in patients between the age of 7 and 12, but that's in the future.
What type of doctor would a patient work with to get a prescription?
For this drug, I'm assuming, when it's commercially available. And that would be most likely the physician who is taking care of your child or patient with PWS syndrome. Most oftentimes, that's the pediatric endocrinologist, or it could, in rare cases, it could be internist, geneticist, or even adult endocrinologist at times.
And the only other thing I'd add from a Zafgen perspective is that if anyone out there needs any kind of referral to a prescribing, physician, once the drug is approved, Zafgen would always be available to provide, referrals, of course.
Mm-hmm. I am getting a number of questions regarding access to the drug once it's approved. We know that typically new drugs are incredibly expensive, and I have several questions regarding, how can will parents be able to afford the drug if it isn't approved by the insurance companies? How costly will the drug be? Will there be assistance to families so that they can get access to the drug? Perhaps you would like to address that line of questioning.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I could start it off and hand it over to you, Alicia, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. So we don't know yet what the drug will cost, but what I can say is if the drug gets FDA approved, we will do our best and to make the drug available as a reimbursed or paid for drug by the insurance company. And in most cases, that should not be a barrier or a problem, because if the drug is shown to be safe and effective in patients with Prader-Willi syndrome, I think most insurance companies would cover it. And I think, instead of guessing at other things, I'll turn it over to you at this point to comment more on, any family assistance that we might offer, and things like that. Alicia.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a great and really important question. I know it would be on my mind if I were a parent thinking about this. And so, you know, obviously ZapGen will be putting in process a number of support services specifically to help patients and their families triage, you know, the benefits verification process with payers, you know, in the United States. Typically for orphan therapies, commercial payers, you know, provide reimbursement. In the event that there's any kind of, you know, copay, you know, structure involved, ZapGen really wants to be able to provide assistance to families so that access is assured. For families who may be underinsured or not have insurance, we'll be contemplating programs to make sure that all PWS patients have some access to beloranib, should it be approved. And then for, you know, Medicare and Medicaid, that's something that ZapGen deals with on a state-by-state basis, particularly with Medicaid and negotiating rebates, but that's something that we do on our end. And so again, to Dennis's point, the price has not been determined. We have to wait and see how the data turns out in the clinical trial. And then we'll be kicking off the process around all of the logistics to make sure that, you know, payers are educated well in advance about Prader-Willi syndrome and beloranib. So more to come on this over the next year.
Our community is full of stories of patients trying to get treatments from medical professionals and being denied by those medical professionals. Is there any strategy in place so that we can request our endocrinologists or other medical professionals to go so that they can be educated on beloranib and consider it as treatment for Prader-Willi syndrome, assuming that it gets approved?
Yeah, I think, you know, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say, you know, between, you know, Dennis's, you know, team and then the commercial team, you know, over the next year or two, we are going to be doing an awful lot to get, you know, field personnel out there to educate, you know, everyone in the pediatric endocrinology space, to also get to geneticists who initially may still be making the diagnosis, as well as to payers, as I alluded to. And so from an educational perspective, we're launching into that kind of activity this year. You know, that said, you know, once the drug is approved, if a physician is not, you know, comfortable or willing to prescribe, again, you know, between FPWR and or, you know, ZapGen, we're happy to provide referrals to physicians who are comfortable prescribing. And we would certainly do our best to try to partner with families to educate any physicians who might need more education or not yet feel totally comfortable. Dennis?
And some of the, that's a great answer, and thank you for that, Alicia. I just wanted to address the other possibility of what may be happening when a physician or a prescriber refuses to, you know, write a prescription for a certain drug to treat a condition. And sometimes that happens because the request is being made for a drug that is outside its indication, to treat a disease or a condition that's outside its original FDA-approved indication. So, for example, just in case the questionnaire is asking about a situation where they may have requested a drug that is approved by the FDA for treatment of obesity, general obesity, a physician may refuse to prescribe that drug for patients with Prader-Willi syndrome because it has not been tested in patients with Prader-Willi syndrome. It has been tested in patients with what I'll call conventional obesity without Prader-Willi syndrome. So there is some, you know, rationale for physicians sometimes not prescribing a certain drug because it's not been tested rigorously enough from their perspective. But that will not be the case if beloranib gets FDA approved for treatment of Prader-Willi syndrome with respect to obesity and hyperphagia.
Next question. If the drug is successful, will there be a long-term maintenance dose to keep weight off? So will this be a long-term treatment, or is this going to be used short-term to remove the extra weight? and then you get off the drug?
We envision that this is going to be a long-term treatment. We've not tested what happens once patients come off the drug in terms of how the body weight may go back up or stay down. And the way we're designing and running these trials is with the full intention, with agreement with the FDA, that this is intended for long-term usage. There's been no drug that's ever been shown to continue to work for obesity treatment or weight loss effects that continue to work once the drug is taken off. So we don't anticipate that once the drug stops, the patients will be able to maintain their body weight. And for all those reasons that I just mentioned, the intention of the drug development and assessment that we're doing is with the plan to offer the drug as a long-term chronically taken medication. Now, that's the intention of our development program. What you may end up doing in real life as a patient, as a parent, and in collaboration with your physician may be more of a personalized situation.
Thank you. We have a question regarding your accommodations so that families can vacation while participating in the study. Could you give some more detail?
Yeah, I think Alice, you're probably most well qualified to answer that question.
Sure. I'm sorry, Susan, did you say vacation?
Yes. So what accommodations are made so that our families can go on vacations and still participate in the study, given that they need to receive a treatment 2 times a week?
Okay. So we have the support of a home health vendor, and as long as the sort of schedule is well planned ahead with your study site, that is something that could be worked out because we have definitely we have provided home health services for patients all across the U.S. So with sufficient lead time, that's something that can be worked out and arranged with a clinical site.
Wonderful. We have one final question. Going back to our previous question about Canada participants, once Canada gets approved, will study locations be set up in Canada, or will Canadians need to come down to a U.S. location?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So we do not have any plans to open sites in Canada. What we are trying to seek approval is for Canadian patients to be enrolled at the nearest U.S. site.
Great, thank you. Well, that is the list of our questions. We had the opportunity to answer all of them. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to present this information to our community. We really appreciate all of the details that you have been able to provide for us. Speaking for myself, I'm absolutely looking forward to hearing about the results of this study, and we're crossing our fingers that it's going to be approved as a potential treatment.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a wonderful day. If anyone has follow-up questions after the event, you are welcome to email me, and I could try to direct those questions to the appropriate people. I'm signing off.
Are you there? It's the other Alice. I want to say one more thing to everybody on the call before we get off the call. We have a very small community. It is so important that people participate in these trials. We've been waiting and waiting and waiting for medication that will help our kids, and now we're here. We have clinical trials on the horizon that are very promising, but we have to have participants in these clinical trials to make all these wonderful things happen. So please consider participating. Please talk positively to other people about participating. I'm available on Facebook or by email for any questions that anybody might have about somebody being a participant, but I would just strongly encourage you, as a mom and a member of this community and a doctor, to please, please step up and participate in these trials. It's just vitally important, not just for your child or your family member, but for our whole community. So I want to thank everybody who's considering it, and I'm happy to answer questions offline about being a participant.
Thank you, Alice. All right, this concludes our webinar. We look forward to having you participate at our future webinars. Have a wonderful afternoon, and goodbye.
Bye.